The year was 1209, and the small French town of Béziers was engulfed in flames. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning wood, and the screams of the dying. The Cathars, a group of heretics who rejected the corruption of the Church, had long been a thorn in the side of the Catholic hierarchy. Now the Church's fury had found its outlet. The Crusaders, driven by a fanatical zeal, massacred everyone in Béziers, regardless of age or gender, in the name of eradicating heresy. This brutal act was just the beginning. Over the next few years, the crusade against the Cathars spread across Occitania, a region in southern France. The violence was relentless, and the Church's message was clear. Those who opposed the true faith would face the ultimate punishment. The Cathars, with their emphasis on poverty and their rejection of the Church's wealth, were seen as a direct threat to the social and religious order. The Church could not allow such a challenge to go unanswered. The Church's power was not just spiritual, it was also political. When the Church needed help, it called upon the secular authorities to enforce its will. This partnership was not one of equals. The Church held the moral and religious authority that shaped society's beliefs, and the secular powers, often more than willing to comply, provided the muscle. The phrase, invocado ad hoc, si opus furit auxilio brachii secularis, invoking the secular arm if necessary, became a common refrain, indicating the Church's readiness to use state power to achieve its goals. In practice, this meant that the Church and the secular authorities worked together seamlessly. When the Church handed over accused heretics to the secular courts, it often asked for leniency, but this was a formality. The secular judges, steeped in the Church's ideology, rarely objected. The historian's view that ecclesiastical inquisitors were at the mercy of secular authorities is a misconception. In reality, the Church's influence was so pervasive that the secular powers often acted as extensions of its will. The persecution of the Cathars in Occitania set a precedent for how the Church would deal with heresy in the future. By the early 13th century, the Inquisition had become a well-oiled machine, with its own procedures and a network of inquisitors. The papal decrees of Gregory IX in 1231 provided a legal framework for the rapid and efficient prosecution of heretics, often at the expense of due process. The Church's authority was absolute, and those who opposed it faced dire consequences. In Catalonia, the Inquisition was particularly active. The region, with its close ties to Occitania, had its own heretical movements to contend with. The Archbishop of Tarragona, the highest ecclesiastical authority in the region, played a central role in the Inquisition's activities. The inquisitors, often Dominican friars, worked closely with the local clergy to identify and punish heretics. The Franciscans, while also involved, took a more supportive role, while the Dominicans became the primary enforcers of the Church's will. The Viscounty of Casalbo, a small but strategically important region in the Pyrenees, became a focal point of the Inquisition's efforts. The Viscount Arnau of Casalbo was a known protector of heretics and a fierce opponent of the Church. The Bishop of Urgell, Ponc de Villemer, elected in 1230 with a mandate to fight heresy, saw the Viscount as a significant threat. In 1232, the bishop and the inquisitor reached an agreement to root out heresy in Casalbo. The situation was so tense that the first inquisitor, Ponc de Planes, was murdered in Casalbo in 1237, an event that only intensified the Inquisition's efforts. The response was swift and brutal. The Archbishop of Tarragona, along with the bishops of Urgell, Lleida, and Vic, led a military campaign against Casalbo. The Viscounty was invaded, and 45 heretics were taken prisoner. The remains of 18 dead heretics were exhumed and burned, a practice that became a common ritual of the Inquisition. The excommunication of the Count of Foix, the Viscount's patron, and the temporary ceding of Casalbo to the Viscount of Cardona marked a significant victory for the Church. The Inquisition's reach extended beyond the living. The remains of those who had died as heretics were disinterred and burned, a practice sanctioned by the canons of the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. The inquisitors believed that the bodies of heretics defiled sacred ground, and their removal was necessary to purify the cemetery. This practice was not just a punishment, but a powerful statement of the Church's authority over both the living and the dead. The impact of the Inquisition was felt far beyond Casalbo. In 1269, the Viscount of Casalbo and his daughter, both dead for decades, were posthumously condemned as heretics, and their remains were ordered to be exhumed and burned. The same fate befell other prominent nobles, such as Ramon de Josa, whose bones were disinterred and burned in the presence of King James I in 1258. The Inquisition's actions in the 1250s and 1260s decimated the traditional noble and baronial families in the Catalan mountains, altering the balance of power in the region. The Inquisition's relentless pursuit of heresy also affected the Templars, a powerful military order that had been accused of heresy. In 1260, Ponc de Vernet, a Templar, was disinterred and burned, and in 1262, the prominent noble Pierre de Fenelon suffered the same fate. These acts demonstrated the Inquisition's strength and the flexibility of the heresy charge, which could be used to target even the most powerful and influential individuals. The Inquisition's activities were not without resistance. In 1278, the Inquisitor Pierre de la Cadarta was assassinated in Casalbo, marking the third Inquisitor to meet such a fate in the Pyrenean lands in less than 4 decades. These assassinations, while tragic, did little to deter the Inquisition. By the end of the 13th century, the Inquisition was firmly established in the Crown of Aragon, integrated into the ecclesiastical structure and supported by the civil power. The Church's authority was absolute, and the Inquisition was its most powerful tool. The flames that had consumed Béziers in 1209 continued to burn, a symbol of the Church's unyielding determination to root out heresy and maintain its dominion over the hearts and minds of the people. In 1235, King James I of Aragon convened an important ecclesiastical parliament in Tarragona. His goal was to improve the kingdom and strengthen the defense of the faith. During this parliament, several laws were passed to combat heresy. One of the most significant laws targeted the possession of unauthorized translations of the Bible. Anyone found with such translations was required to turn them over to the local bishop to be burned within 8 days. If they failed to do so, they would be considered heretics. The Parliament also established strict measures to prevent heretics from holding positions of power. Royal representatives, such as bailiffs and vicars, were not allowed to be suspected of heresy. To enforce these laws, the king and the church worked together. They created a system where priests and laypeople were appointed to investigate suspicious places and report any heretics. This joint effort ensured that both religious and royal authorities were involved in the fight against heresy. The king's laws also included severe penalties for those who supported heretics. If someone allowed heretics to live on their land, they would lose their property and face possible execution. For example, in 1263, King James I confiscated the assets of Berenguer Amorós in Siurana after he was burned at the stake for heresy. This was part of a broader campaign by the Inquisition, which was active in the mountains of Prades and Siurana. The Inquisition's efforts led to numerous executions and the seizure of assets. The Inquisition's methods were well organized and systematic. Inquisitors were appointed by the Pope and worked closely with local bishops. They had the authority to investigate heresy and punish those found guilty. The Inquisition's activities were not limited to one region. They extended from the Pyrenees to the Valencian mountains. These areas were connected by transhumance routes, making them particularly vulnerable to the spread of heretical ideas. Between 1258 and 1262, the king distributed many assets confiscated from heretics in cities like Tortosa, Lleida, Morla, and Valbona of Valencia. The Inquisition continued to evolve over time. In the 14th century, the process of inquisition became more standardized. Each diocese had a deputy inquisitor who could act on behalf of the main inquisitor. This allowed the Inquisition to operate more efficiently and cover a wider area. The inquisitors worked closely with the local bishops, who often delegated their authority to the diocese's official. Trials followed a structured process with the prosecution and defense, and a notary recorded all proceedings. If necessary, torture could be used to extract confessions, though this required a special court order. The Inquisition's focus shifted over time. In the early 14th century, the Cathar heresy was still a concern, as seen in the capture and execution of Bilibast in 1321. However, the Inquisition also turned its attention to other groups, such as the Beghards and Beguines, who advocated for poverty and rejected traditional church practices. These groups were particularly active in regions like Catalonia and southern France. In 1321, Durin de Baldach from Girona and his companions were burned at the stake for spreading Beghard ideas. Similar fates befell other Beghards and Beguines in the following years, with some being executed in Narbonne and others in Girona. The Inquisition's harsh methods were not limited to executions. Those who recanted their heretical beliefs could be spared, but were often required to wear a visible sign of their past, such as a cross on their clothing. This was a form of perpetual punishment and public humiliation. The Inquisition's activities were closely monitored by the king, who shared financial penalties with the church. This cooperation between the secular and religious authorities ensured that the Inquisition remained a powerful tool in maintaining the purity of the faith. Throughout the 14th century, the Inquisition continued to adapt and refine its methods. The appointment of deputies and the standardization of procedures allowed the Inquisition to operate more effectively. The Church and the monarchy worked together to suppress heresy, ensuring that the kingdom remained faithful to the teachings of the Catholic Church. In the early 1300s, southern France, especially cities like Montpellier, Toulouse, and Carcassonne, saw a wave of executions by burning. Over 100 people were put to death, many of them accused of heresy. Some of these individuals had connections across the Pyrenees, showing the deep links between communities in southern France and those in Catalonia. Among those burned were the Beguines and Beghards, who were groups dedicated to living a life of voluntary poverty. One Beguine named Astruga de Rendaria, who lived in Narbonne but was from the Diocese of Girona, declared that Christ and the Apostles never owned anything, and that Pope John the 22nd was the Antichrist. These radical ideas were central to the persecution of the Beguines and Beghards, as Pope John the 22nd had condemned such beliefs. The movement for voluntary poverty was seen as dangerous, especially in Catalonia, where it was viewed as an internal threat with little impact on the wider population. In 1320, two individuals, Pierre Aller from Majorca and a friar named Bonanat, were tried in Barcelona for heresy. Pierre Aller was sentenced to be burned, while Bonanat escaped by renouncing his beliefs. However, when Bonanat was later found guilty of repeating his offenses, he too was burned, and his house in Villafranca del Penedès, a center of Begharism, was demolished. Heresy did not always lead to death. In some cases, the accused were given life sentences or forced to live in specific places under surveillance. For example, in Villafranca del Penedès in 1344 to 1346, many accused were simply ordered to live apart, and their assets were confiscated. This approach was seen as a way to prevent heretics from becoming martyrs, which had happened in the past when many were burned at the stake. The inquisitors often worked with secular authorities to enforce their decisions. For instance, in 1315, King James II of Majorca helped the inquisitor arrest Bartomeu Doms in Roussillon. In 1333, a royal sergeant in Roussillon assisted in keeping heretics under arrest. When a death sentence was handed down, the inquisitor would turn the accused over to the secular authorities, who would carry out the execution. In Lleida in 1447, a Moorish alfaqui named Brahim Karadi was burned after being found guilty of heresy by the bishop and the inquisitor. The secular authorities generally accepted the ecclesiastical court's verdicts without further investigation. For example, in Majorca in 1407, a convert accused of heresy was sentenced to death by the bishop and the inquisitor, and the secular court carried out the execution without reopening the case. The costs of these executions, such as buying firewood, were often recorded, showing the practical details of these grim proceedings. The relationship between the Inquisition and the monarchy was complex. Sometimes, the inquisitor's broad interpretation of his powers led to conflicts with the king. One notable dispute involved Nicolau Aimeric, who clashed with King Peter the Ceremonious and later King John I over jurisdictional issues. Aimeric's actions, such as his pursuit of the works of Ramon Llull and his involvement in jurisdictional conflicts in Tarragona, often put him at odds with the monarchy. The Inquisition's interventions were supposed to be limited to cases of heresy. However, when the inquisitors tried to extend their reach into areas traditionally under the jurisdiction of secular officials, such as cases involving Jews, it led to significant tension. For example, in Montblanc between 1389 and 1391, A Jew was accused of owning a book by Maimonides that ridiculed Jesus. This case sparked a dispute between the Inquisitor and Prince Martin, the brother of King John I, over who had the right to punish the accused. The underlying issue, as some historians suggest, was financial, as both sides sought to gain from the accused's wealth. Over time, the Inquisition began to issue more sentences that did not involve execution by burning, often fining the accused instead. This shift reflected a broader trend in how heresy was handled, moving away from the immediate and severe punishment of the past. In the early 1300s, the concept of heresy was quite different from what it would become by the end of the century. In the city of Vic, for example, a woman named Raimunda de Campis was accused of heresy and sentenced to life in prison. However, she was eventually freed after she publicly renounced her beliefs. Despite this, she fled the city, fearing she might be accused again. At this time, heresy was often linked to practices like healing or witchcraft. As the century progressed, the nature of heresy charges began to change. Accusations of heresy became less about alternative religious beliefs, and more about sorcery, witchcraft, and blasphemy. This shift was partly because of a growing fear of the devil, which entered Christian thought between 1280 and 1330. Pope John XXII even asked theologians to explain how invoking demons and practicing witchcraft could be considered heresy. This change meant that heresy was no longer just a matter of what someone thought or said, but also what they did. The people accused of heresy also changed. Instead of targeting notable figures, the Inquisition began to focus on people from the lower levels of society. For instance, in 1389, a woman named Borodana was arrested in Leda for a fight in a hostel. When it was discovered that she knew curative spells and invoked the devil, she was handed over to the Inquisition as a heretic. In Majorca, a Muslim slave named Raimunda Oliveri was accused of using perfumes against her master's wife and was burned at the stake. Her accomplice, also a Muslim, was similarly condemned. These cases show that the Inquisition was now targeting individuals from lower social strata, especially non-Christians like Muslims. In Leyda in 1447, a Muslim man named Brahim Karadi was executed for heresy. His crimes included black magic and spreading errors against the Catholic faith. This case alarmed the Muslim community, as Brahim was an important religious leader in Syros, a significant Muslim town. The Inquisition's actions were often justified by the need to maintain social order and honor God. In Girona in 1427, after a major earthquake, the city was gripped by fear. The people believed the earthquake was God's punishment for tolerating sinners. A woman, the wife of a baker, was accused of worshipping demons and sacrificing children. The city council asked the archbishop to decide her fate, quickly to appease God's wrath. This shift in the nature of heresy accusations was not unique to Catalonia. Across Europe, the fear of the devil and the persecution of witches became more common. The Inquisition also began to focus on converts from Judaism, who were suspected of secretly maintaining their old beliefs. In 1346, a convert in Perpignan was burned at the stake for heresy. On Majorca in 1407, a convert named Jaume de Galiana was similarly executed after being found guilty of renouncing his Christian faith. The Inquisition's focus on converts and non-Christians was not without controversy. In 1387, King John I of Aragon told the Pope that the Inquisition should not interfere with Jews and Muslims, as they were under royal jurisdiction. However, the Inquisition's activities against lower-class, non-Christians were generally accepted. By the end of the 1400s, the Inquisition had evolved into a more ruthless and politically driven institution. In 1478, Pope Sixtus IV created a new Inquisition for Castile and Leon, which was extended to the Crown of Aragon in 1483. This new Inquisition, led by clergymen appointed by the king, had more power and fewer legal protections for the accused. The entry of the inquisitors into cities was a grand and intimidating affair, designed to instill fear and ensure support from local authorities. This new Inquisition marked the end of the medieval period and the beginning of a more intolerant society, where religious otherness was met with harsh punishment. The inquisitors aimed to control not just the deeds and words, but also the thoughts of the people, ensuring that the population lived in fear and conformed to the desired social order. The events of the late 15th and early 16th centuries marked a significant shift in the social and political landscape of the Iberian Peninsula, particularly in Spain. During this time, the monarchy and the church sought to unify society under a common ideology, leading to the expulsion and conversion of those who did not conform to the dominant Christian norms. This period saw the systematic persecution of Jews and Muslims, culminating in the expulsion of Jews in 1492, and the forced conversion or expulsion of Muslims at the beginning of the 16th century. The Inquisition played a crucial role in this process, targeting not only those who were openly non-Christian, but also those suspected of secretly practicing their old faith, known as crypto-Jews and crypto-Muslims. The Inquisition's methods were often extreme, involving the fabrication of records and the use of severe punishments. In Saragossa, for example, between 1484 and 1515, nearly a quarter of the converts judged by the Inquisition ended up being burned at the stake. The execution by burning was not just a means of punishment, but also a ritual that involved the participation of the community. This public spectacle was intended to cleanse the social body of those considered contaminating and to serve as a deterrent to others. Even when the accused could not be found, the Inquisition would burn effigies to maintain the ritual's symbolic and instructive purpose. In Lleida in 1487, the statues of Ruiz and Joan Pujol were burned, and in Barcelona in 1497 and 1501, members of the Falco family, a prominent Jewish family from Girona, were also burned in effigy. These practices reflect a broader trend of intolerance and exclusion. The cohesion of society under the monarchy and Christianity defined who belonged and who did not. Those who were deemed inassimilable, such as Jews and Muslims, were systematically marginalized and expelled. This intolerance became a defining characteristic of the modern social and political structures that emerged during this period. The Inquisition's role in this process was not just about punishment, but also about reinforcing the ideological and political unity of the state. By targeting and eliminating those who deviated from the accepted norms, the Inquisition helped to create a homogeneous society that aligned with the monarchy's and the church's goals. This period of intense persecution and exclusion left a lasting impact on the social fabric of Spain, shaping the nation's identity and influencing its future development. In essence, the expulsion and persecution of Jews and Muslims, along with the harsh methods of the Inquisition, were not isolated events but part of a larger process of social and political unification. This process, while brutal and exclusionary, helped to solidify the identity of Spain as a Christian nation, a legacy that continues to influence the country's history and culture.